So, welcome everyone to Talk to Us. Today, we have the opportunity to speak with Brian Lynn on an interesting topic of career choices. Everyone chooses their careers, but often we are influenced by someone else in our lives who helps us choose. So, welcome, Brian.
Glad to be here. Thanks for asking me back.
What was this article that you wrote about recently?
There's this nurse, and she's in California, and the story focuses on her and what she's doing. She's helping give vaccines to people there in California, but she also goes into the history of how and why she decided to become a nurse. And part of the story is that her own mother also became a nurse. And the way her mother started was she was actually caring for patients in the pandemic in 1918, the flu pandemic. Um, so she was saying in the story that she felt a very closeness to her mom. As I say, now she's 76 years old, and um, she was saying in the story that because of her age, she wasn't able to do um, all of her nursing duties as she normally would because she was also at risk because of her age for COVID-19. But she was able to give vaccines. And part of the story, too, is that even though she's 76 years old, she's still working. She says she has no plans to give up her career and retire, and especially now when she has so much to give and she can help out with this pandemic, which is a historic thing that we haven't seen since going back to when her mother was helping in the pandemic of 1918. I guess the story, like I say, was focusing on her, the work she's doing, but also we kind of wanted to get into the career aspect and find out how people joining us today maybe came to the choice of their career, or if they have stories like this, maybe in their family or friends who decided to enter the career because they were volunteering, or maybe they were just doing some other activity, a hobby, a sport, and they decided, oh, this is maybe what I want to do. Or was it more a case where they always knew and they just kind of said, this is what I want to do. I know I want to do it, and just focus on that direction. So there's a lot of directions you can go. And that's the story. And that's kind of how we want to focus the discussion.
I was just going to share that I didn't know I was going to become a teacher. My mother was a teacher, and like Brian was describing in the story, I had done some volunteer teaching in university, and I decided that I really loved it. So I didn't decide as a young person, I just experiences happened in my life, and that's how I ended up teaching. But I also realized years later that, my mother was a teacher, so it was an influence on me. And we would love to hear about what career you chose and also how you chose it today. So that is our first question. I'm curious about Brian. How did you become a journalist, Brian? And then we're going to hear from others. But
Well, I guess I was one of those people who knew at a very young age kind of what I wanted to do. Um, and it's kind of funny too, because my mom tells stories about when I was quite young. Back then, we there were actually tape recorders, which a lot of people who are obviously younger wouldn't even use them, but just like a phone, so you could record, but it was a lot bigger and had an actual microphone. And so it's quite a young kid. I used to uh, get people together from the neighborhood and do little shows and interview them about different things. We used to even put on little shows like, oh, we're going to do a little soap opera. So I was kind of trying to wanted to direct that, and just doing things like recording people and then putting it together and things like that. And so for some reason, I had in my head that that's kind of what I wanted to do. And it started out like that. And so really when I got into the later years of high school, it was just thinking, how can I do that to prepare? So I was on worked on the newspaper for the high school and was the editor there, and then just went into college and of course said, oh, I'm going to study journalism, and then became broadcasting first, which again goes back to that taping and the recording people. So that's kind of how it happened with me, and I just stuck with it. But it did start at a very young age. For some reason, I had that interest, and then it just kind of stuck.
Wonderful. Thank you, Brian.
I want to share my experience. I was an engineer for many years. And during that time, I worked in a computer company. Part of my job is to teach the people who wrote our computers. So I taught them how to use computer, how to set up them. And then I went back to school again, and I get a license, and now I'm teaching Chinese as a second language. So that's my job right now.
So it sounds like you started with one career and then you moved to another career as time went by.
Yeah, right. Because I think when I worked in the computer company, when I working as an engineer, I have not much joy. But when I teaching some students to use computers, I think it's more interesting. And I think if I can teach language, it will be much interesting. So I changed my career, and I made a great decision. For me, I enjoy my teaching job very much.
I was a software engineer. Of course, I didn't work in that field. I studied engineering of software, but what I was interesting was the language learning, and that time at the same time I tried and I studied the language in the academies. And I remember that first time when my teacher asked me and invited me to teach for 10 minutes. It was so much joyful for me. And from that time, I don't forget that moment, never. And I was really interested in teaching. Then after my BA, I transferred my major to study language academically. Then now I'm studying the Master of English Teaching Language, and somehow I'm teaching partly the language, and I really enjoy that sharing information and what I know with people and contacting with people. I really enjoy my job.
Yeah, it's important that we love some aspect of our career because we spend most of our lives doing it, right?
Yeah, I think that's a good point, because I also have had friends who went into one field and decided quite quickly that they didn't like it. And some of them were making a very good living. They were making a lot of money doing it. And if they had stayed with it, they could have made a lot more money. But they also decided, I can't do this. I can't do this. And so most of them changed careers and went to something where they weren't making as much money, but where they enjoyed it. So I think maybe that happens more often than we think.
When I was very young, one day in the summer break, I remembered of my first year of the high school. I was with a friend of mine who lived in the same street in my hometown. It's a small town. Her parents' house was just several doors away from my parents. Her older sister's classmate was visiting them. This girl was a freshman in a college. I didn't know her, though we studied in the same high school, because the year I entered our high school when she was just leaving for college. So we were in the living room that day of my friend's house with her parents. We chatted a lot, but one thing I remembered, we were quietly and curiously listening to the freshman talking about her first year college life in a big city because I was grown up in a small town. So it was so fascinating. I admired her very much. She said she would be an engineer after graduation and would be promoted to a higher position in the future and work in a big city. I thought it would be great to be an engineer, though I had no idea what an engineer would look like as a teenager, so young. So I worked at a steel pipe factory as an engineer after I graduated from college. So I think as a teenager, a good example is very important for his or her growth and career development. As Brian told the story, cigarette, because her mama is her good example.
I graduated from school this year at 5 December 2020. Before quarantine, I want to become a judge in the future. So when pandemic started and our government announced that quarantine, so I start searching. So when I read to this idea that what we are doing at the future is serving for humans. What we can be an engineer, we can be an designer, we can be a doctor, or etc. Just our goal is serving to humans, and the human first need is health. So now I want to become a doctor. So uh, I want to prepare myself to TOEFL or IELTS exam to study abroad scholarships like Fulbright or Chevening. Therefore, I'm studying hard, and my career and who influenced on me was one of my relatives. He works in Turkey, and now he is a doctor here, and he worked as a volunteer doctor during pandemic. So he influenced to me, and now I want to become a doctor.
That's a very similar
Thanks.
story to the story that we had about the California nurse.
It's going to comment on Shada, and it's interesting that you had a decision, and then this pandemic and the quarantine happened, and then you changed your thinking around what you want to do with your life, which is similar, as Brian said in the story.
So after my graduation, I started working as a volunteer in the NGO who looks after street children, feeding daily and looking after their health. And during those days, a friend of mine advised me to work in the bank, in a multinational bank. He recommended to join, and in those days there were limited banks, and that's a lucrative job for everyone. So I also joined that multinational bank. From that, I'm still working in different bank. That's my career. But before that, my father was government officer, and he recommended me to join government office. But my mind was not to join government office, rather to join private organization. Then I joined, so there I joined the private organization, still working in the bank. And apart from that, I think after certain years after retirement, I would like to work as a social worker.
I began a career as a doctor in 1965. I think my mother influenced me because when I was a child, she was very ill at the time. And then I think that made me the idea to be a doctor in my life. Then in 1965, I began a doctor career, and I studied at university all the career. But in 1972, here in Uruguay, became the dictatorship. We have a dictatorship. That dictatorship during 10 years in Uruguay. And then when the dictatorship came in Uruguay, and in those years, all of us, well, I stopped to study for 10 years. And I'm still working my work, but I stopped studying. I take my attention for my works on my family, but I don't study for 10 years. Then when the dictatorship ends in 1984, I began to study again. And then I began to study psychology. And graduated about 5 years later. I graduated as a psychologist, and I worked. I have my works. I still have my works as a secretary in a hospital, and then I began to work as psychologist, as a clinical psychologist, and I work till I stopped to work because I'm retired, but I love that career, really love.
Sorry, is there a reason you decided to go into the psychology from a medical?
When the dictatorships end, I have to do the last examination. The last examination, I have to do the clinical examination as a doctor. But in those time, I had 4 examinations to end the doctor's career. But I was working in a hospital. I had my family. I have children, and in those time I need to change the hours of my works, and was difficult. It was too difficult. For that reason, and I don't take the last examination and the doctor's careers again, because changes the terms of words was difficult. But study of psychology was a night, and that hours study lends me to work, to have my family and study. And then I love my choose, because I love psychology. I love. Yes.
That must be a very good feeling that we could all look forward to, is once we're retired and we've worked in that career, and we can look back and say, I loved it, and if I could do it, I would just keep doing it. But now I have to retire.
Yes, I love very much.
So yeah, sounds like your family also influenced your career choices based on the responsibilities you had. You had to, choose a certain career that could also help you do your, take care of your responsibilities with your family.
I want to talk about my father, as he lived in a very small village in Upper Egypt, and my grandfather was a farmer, and all the family have to be a farmers. But my father didn't follow his father's step, and decided to complete his education. And he was one of only 3 persons who completed their education in this village until to the college, and he graduated from finance college and became an accountant. And then he influenced me, and I also go to a finance college and became an accountant.
That's an interesting one too, because if the tradition was that all the people became farmers and then all of a sudden that was broken, that must have been he must have been very determined. I don't know if you understand that word, but very determined, very strong desire to break out and do something else, because it
Yes,
must have been difficult.
he told me that to go to a high school, he have to walk about 1 hour to go to the high school.
Mm.
So, Yasmin, it sounds like your father was, respecting the culture of, his family, but he also had to respect what he wanted. So he did both. He couldn't, do 100% what his family was doing, but he also wanted to choose what he wanted. So I think that, we all make those decisions because I'm sure in all of our countries, I mean, Brian, I don't know if did anyone encourage you to become what you became, or did you just become it? Your job, your career, Did someone tell you you're gonna do this?
No, they didn't. And in fact, when I talked about doing it or the fact that I wanted to do it, a lot of people said, "No, you shouldn't do that. That's you could make more money. You could that's a very difficult career to find a good paying job. So maybe do something else." And I always, as you know, in my own mind, still wanted to do it and said, well, I'm just going to do as much as I can, do as well as I can. But it never really, I never seriously thought of something else. And maybe if, there had been somebody encouraging me to do something else, I might have considered, but I just had it in my mind, this is what I want to do.
Because I think in a lot of our cultures, and maybe I'm generalizing, our family usually or sometimes tells you you're going to do this job.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe it's something you've heard before, and we have to decide: do we do what we want, or do we listen to our family, or do it's a decision.
Right. It's a decision. You're right. And in some families, it's even the let's say it's a family business that has been around for many years, and the tradition is that the children, the sons or the daughters, take over that. It could be a farm, a farming business, or it could be some other small business that the family has. And so that would put even more pressure on that person, because it's not just their choice, it's also the future of that business. And they might feel like if I don't carry on with that, then maybe the business fails and then I disappoint my family. So there can be those other factors that can be very big, put a lot of pressure on people too. You're right. And depending on what culture you're in.
Actually, the first thing I should mention that my story, I didn't like to be a teacher. I'm English teacher for 19 years, and it's first time to tell my story, because I didn't want to be a teacher, because no one of my family is teacher, and they are always speaking about how can a human speak for 3 or 4 hours to his students. For 4 years in university, I decided that I'll not be a teacher. And then I worked as an English teacher. And after 3 years of teaching English, I remember that day, 3 of my students, they were young men, they came to the door of my classroom and they said, "Mister, we are successful now because of you." I was staring at them. Really? Did I inspire you in your life? So this was the turning point in my life. And after that, I realized that I have something to give to my local community and my people. So I decided to study more. I decided to join high degrees to help more people. This is simply my story.
We asked this question to our followers on Instagram. And I'll just show you, around 40 people responded. I just want to share some responses. Greg from Taiwan is a trade promoter. Adam from Brazil works in administration and teaching. There's also some teachers here who do their best to influence teachers in their country. We have a woman who's a nurse, or a man who's a nurse. Just wanted to share some of the ways people decided. We have some programmers, and it's really good to not only think of our career as something we individually decided, but also what it does for other people. We have Ms. Sheikhpur, who's a nursing professor. So we won't go through all of them, but you can see that people like to talk about their careers since you spend most of your lives doing a career.
I want to say that before saying about my motivation and who influenced me, I want to explain two terms about the teaching. We know the first thing that we do in the teaching, we should deal with the two aspects and two view of teaching. We see teaching as an art or as a craft. The first thing and the first person who explained me these two terms, she told me that, and she was my teacher. She told me that you have the art of teaching. That was something new for me. I didn't know what exactly she talked about, but as I continued, I had the positive feedbacks from my students, and that was something really encouraged me to continue. Uh, I want to say that for continuing and for being successful in any career, we need two extrinsic and intrinsic motivation. But any motivation which is intrinsic starts by an extraneous stimulus. And I think that person was that stimulus for me. She started she paved the way for me, and that was the continue of that was what the students give back to me, and it was really joyful for me.
Yes. What I want to speak about, no, Brian told about family line, family business. Big family must have their children follow their steps. What I want to speak about famous people, children of famous people. I don't know how it is in the USA, but in Russia, in Soviet Union, there were a lot of famous people, TV, famous literature, famous, no, like in every country. Everywhere is famous people. What their children, I know, it looked like they should have followed the steps of their fathers and mothers and also became famous. But in practice, in reality, it didn't work. And many children of many Soviet Union famous people became nobody. They wanted to be somebody, but they didn't have such abilities as their parents. So they became, and many people I know died at early age. For example, when they were 30, 40 years old, because so psychological pressure on them, they couldn't bear such pressure. So they started to drink too much. And no, so my idea is that if your parents are famous or rich, it doesn't necessarily mean that you should be famous also and rich. You have to follow your own way, route.
That's a very good point, and it makes sense. It happens in the United States too. You have the same thing. I think there is that pressure from the parents and from society sometimes to follow in those footsteps, but it doesn't always work. You can't force that to happen, right?
It reminds me of a Khalil Gibran poem. He's a poet from Lebanon, and he says that your children are not yours, right? You can't, it's not like a phone. You can take it and put it in your pocket and do what you want with it. Your children come to you, but they also are for the world, right? So you can't tell someone you are going to be this, because that's not giving them the choice. And the fact is, the children are, you may take care of your children, but they also have their own free will and their choice.